Hi everyone, and welcome to the video demonstrating Lab 6 for the Virtual Infrastructure course. This lab, we have two tasks. The first one is to configure VCSA such that it authenticates to Active Directory. The second is to configure Active Directory as an identity source for a single sign-on. So let's get started. I've already logged into my student workstation, and within that, I've already launched Firefox as my browser. So the first thing I'm going to do is authenticate into the VCSA configuration page. So I'll simply put in my address going to port 5480. Once that comes up, I will log in with the root account and my secret 55 password. I definitely do not want Firefox to update at this moment. Now, the way that we go about configuring this, I'm going to click on the Authentication tab, which is going to bring up our information about Active Directory. You can see that Active Directory is not enabled right now. I am going to enable that. The domain is going to be itss.local. The administrator password is going to be vstudent. And my password is going to be secret55. So all I need to do is save those settings. And we can see that the operation is successful. So basically, we're now in a position that if we need to authenticate into VCSA from an administrative perspective, as long as I have rights assigned from Active Directory, then I'll be able to authenticate from the itss.local domain. Now in your book, it says to restart vCenter server. You do not need to do that. All it's going to do is waste a bunch of time, so I'm not going to bother. End of task one, pretty straightforward. The next thing we're going to do is add Active Directory as an identity source for single sign-on. I could either log out of this screen and log into my other site. I'm just going to open another tab, and here I'm going to put in the address for, again, VCSA, but I'm going to be using port 9443 like we use when we sign on to actually administer our virtual machines and other vSphere resources. Once the screen initializes and we log in, rather than logging in with a root account, I'm going to log in with administrator at vSphere.local. That is the special account and domain that VMware uses to allow us to administer single sign-on. And I'll use the password VMware, which is the standard for that. This account, like any administrative account, once you have your own accounts set up from a security perspective, should be disabled. At absolute minimum, change the password from VMware to something else. We're not going to do that because it's not required as part of the lab. Once we're in, I'm going to select administration in the navigation pane over on the left. We can see there's a single sign-on section. There is both configuration and users and groups. So I'm going to start with configuration. We can see that there is the ability to set things like password policies and lockout policies for any accounts that are part of that vSphere.local domain. I'm going to configure identity sources. So I'll click on the Identity Sources tab. We can see that the identity sources we have right now are vSphere.local, which is the LDAP domain that's created here, plus local OS. So that's any user accounts that are actually in Linux, which is supporting VCSA. I'm going to add in a new identity source. Going from the information that's going to be on your student sheet, we'll be able to see the information that needs to be entered in here. So this is going to be Active Directory as an LDAP server. I'm going to have to provide a bunch of information about that. So the name of the actual identity service itself is itss.local. That does not have to match the domain, but it's good practice to use that name so that you know where the resources are that are providing the authentication and authorization services. Base DN for users. This is going to be the location of the users that we're going to be responding to or authenticating. So I'm going to do cn equals users, comma, dc equals ITSS, comma, dc equals local. So basically the container within Active Directory that has all the default users. Now that's fine for what we're doing because this is the way the lab is set up. Normal production circumstances, you probably have an organizational unit somewhere that would contain those user and group accounts. We're going to reuse this information later on, so I'm going to copy that information, and I'm going to paste that in the base DN for groups, which is down here as well. And that will be, the users and groups are going to be in the same container. Now the domain name, this is the FQDN of the domain name. I don't really like that term. It should be more like the DNS style domain name, so that's itss.local. The domain alias is the net BIOS name, so that's just ITSS. The primary server that we're going to use for authentication, we want to be able to use any domain controller from the domain. So what we're going to do is specify LDAP : / and then itss.local and port 389. If we wanted to use a specific server, specific domain controller within the Active Directory domain, we wouldn't use just itss.local here. We would actually specify the entire FQDN for the server. But this is going to be good for our purposes because if you simply specify the domain name, single sign-on service is smart enough to go and talk to DNS and find a domain controller. We're not going to have a secondary server. Username, this is going to be vstudent at itss.local. It's important to use the UPN format for specifying the user account that's going to be used for authentication and to set up the service. And then the password, of course, for that user account is secret55. We'll make sure that we can connect over and talk to the domain. So we test the connection. That's successful. This is good for us. And now by clicking OK, we should have a new identity service that will show up. And sure enough, here we see itss.local. It specifies the URL on how we're going to find that particular Active Directory domain. At this point in time, we can use that Active Directory domain to start adding users and groups into our rights specifications for who's allowed to do what for VCSA. So the next thing I'm going to do is select users and groups. We can see that within the collection of groups, we have a number here. In our particular case, we're interested in administrators. And we can see when we select that the only user that's able to administer VCSA is the administrator account on vcsa.local. Now we're going to set it up so that members of the ESXi admins group in our Active Directory domain can also administer this server. So I'm going to here add a member, and I'm not going to add from vSphere.local. I'll click on the drop down and I can pick itss.local. And within this, I'm going to select that ESXi admins group. So we can see here, for example, is our student account and all the rest of that kind of good thing. I'm going to do a quick search. I'm just going to put in ESX and search for that. Here's the ESX admins group. I'll add that in and say OK. And now we can see that ESX admins group from itss.local is a member of the administrators group in vSphere.local. So that means now that anybody who is a member of ESX admins is going to have the rights to manage single sign-on within VCSA. Nothing outside of single sign-on. At this point in time, one of the things I would typically do from a security perspective, even though it's not part of the lab, I would create another local user here that is going to have administrative rights. I would add them into the administrators group, and then I would disable this administrator account in order to increase my security. In any case, that's it for this lab. The only part that's left is for you to log in as a member of ESXi admins and see what you can see. I'm going to leave that for you to do and then put in your lab book what you found out. Hope this video was helpful, and we'll see you next time.